Thanks for coming back again as we keep going in this book, Following the Call, Living the Sermon on the Mount Together. We're on chapter 9, the Merciful. Let's first read the beatitude that this chapter speaks about. Matthew 5:7. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. So mercy is it's a topic that one can read a lot about in the Bible. There are so many stories of God's mercy to his people, people being merciful to one another. And definitely in the New Testament, the stories of Jesus having mercy on the sinners, on people whose lives are not in accordance with God's teachings, is probably, that's one of the more outstanding features of the gospel narratives, I think. Mm-hmm. And, most profoundly when Jesus is on the cross and is merciful to those who are mocking him and scorning him, and prays for their forgiveness. Mm-hmm. So, this is a really central value of the kingdom of God. And I think, it's one that is close to all of us because we all, I think, know that we're in need of mercy ourselves.
And we're grateful when
we are grateful when we receive mercy from other people, when we come up short. The difficulty arises when we often are not merciful toward other people because we have an innate sense of justice. Mm-hmm. And when someone falls short of that justice, we are quick to castigate them and be hard on them and hold them to standards that maybe we don't hold ourselves to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I was thinking about how this chapter also connects to later in Matthew 5, I think it's verse 38 or somewhere after that, where Jesus talks about how, the concept of justice was an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, but I tell you to not, I'm not sure how he put it, but to not resist the evildoer. Mm-hmm. And I think that in that sense, he's not talking about being passive and weak. It's more just this different concept of how we all need mercy, but you can only really receive that if you yourself are merciful.
Right.
So it's just a different form. And like you were talking about the Easter story, I think another part of that, which is really important, is how Jesus extended mercy to his someone else who was also on a cross with him, the thief on the cross, and how he easily could have just not been able to relate with somebody who had spent their life stealing or committing some other crime or wrongdoing. But he did, and he extended that himself, the most perfect person, or, the
only perfect person, yeah. So in this chapter, we have two sections, one by Charles Moore, who's the editor of this book, of this collection of writings, and Leo Tolstoy. Charles talks about, what really is mercy. And he says to have mercy is to have the feeling of another person. To have mercy is to have the feeling for another person that a mother has for her children. So a very close bond. And he quotes William Barclay, who says, mercy is the ability to get right inside the other person's skin until we can see things with his eyes, think things with his mind, and feel things with his feelings. Mercy suffers with the sufferer. It demands investment and involvement. And, the subtitle of this book is Living the Sermon on the Mount Together. So for us, living as we do a life together, trying to be obedient to Jesus and follow his teachings, mercy is just such a crucial component of our life together. I don't think we would survive a day without it.
Yeah.
If the requirement for someone to live here in Christian community was that they never screwed up, it would be a pretty small community.
Yeah.
rapidly diminishing community.
Yeah, and I would say an example of that, at least for me personally, is like when we are together and an issue needs addressing, or somebody personally has to own up or admit to something within our setting. What is it amazing to me, and I've experienced it personally as well, is it takes a lot of courage to share that, obviously, and to be that vulnerable. But then the response is always overwhelming of so many people who will approach you if you're dealing with a certain battle and let you know, like, hey, you know, this was my experience, or I totally understand, and you're going to get through this. Or to me, that's just, I mean, maybe it seems obvious, but it's always overwhelming, and it's really precious and also uplifting in community.
It's not obvious, I don't think, and I think that's something that we've had to work toward, and something we, you know, constantly need to remind ourselves, because you look at other forms of community. I'm thinking of particularly social media communities, places like Twitter, where if someone makes a mistake or a misstep, generally there's a pile-on, and people point out all the different ways this person is horrible, and something that may be just a small faux pas or misstatement, or may even be something that's egregiously wrong that someone says, they're immediately canceled and you know, basically sent out of polite social media society. So that could potentially happen in a you know, in a Christian community, and this is a virtue that we have to constantly remind ourselves of, and never allow that sort of stone throwing to happen.
That's a really good point. It's also harder to do when you're face to face, though.
Well,
luckily.
The other part of this that I think is really important to remember, and Leo Tolstoy talks about this, is how mercy, loving activity, compassion, these are things that are contagious. I think it's probably commonly true that it's difficult to have a sense of kinship with someone who always has it together, who's always successful, who's always right about things, who always has the right word, and never seems to make a mess of things. What one does immediately feel, and again, I think this is a common experience, is that you do feel a sense of kinship with someone who doesn't, who fails, who admits that they are not perfect, who you know, makes mistakes over and over again, and is not too proud to admit that.
Yeah, and I think that's more, I mean, that's definitely more realistic, because, you know, if you're trying to garner a sense of kinship with somebody who is so perfect, essentially you end up just living a facade. Like, it's not true. So I totally agree with that. And also, another point that's brought up in this chapter that I was wondering what you thought of, Rich, was, is it possible to forgive too much? There's an example here of a young priest who kind of was wondering, you know, is that the case? He heard a lot of confessions, and he said, you know, when he's feeling like maybe he's gone too far with forgiveness, he says, I go to our chapel and stand in front of the tabernacle and say to Jesus, Lord, forgive me if I have forgiven too much, but you're the one who gave me the bad example.
That's a very cool anecdote.
Yeah.
It's a good question, because I think, I mean, we often have the words justice and mercy in the same phrase. You know, they kind of go together, even though they're in some ways opposing sentiments. I don't think we can forgive too much. I do think we shouldn't offer cheap grace. This is something Bonhoeffer talks about in Life Together. Cheap grace is basically just saying, you know, it's okay. You screwed up, it's okay. Because it actually isn't okay to do things that are wrong. So I think there has to be, mercy has to be tempered with justice. And, you know, if someone's done something that hurts someone else, they need to see that for what it is and feel sorry for having hurt someone. And I don't think it's helpful to them or actually loving to them or even merciful to them to just say, oh, that's not such a big deal.
Yeah, that's true.
So I think justice and mercy really need to go hand in hand.
That's a great way of putting it.
Yeah. One prayer that's always meant a lot to me is the Jesus prayer, which I found out recently was discovered first written on the cells of the Desert Fathers in the 5th century. So it's a prayer that goes almost back to the beginning of Christianity, and it's a prayer you just repeat and repeat. It says, "Jesus, Son of the Living God, have mercy on me, a sinner," and it's a prayer that these monastics would just repeat over and over and over again. And I think that kind of shows like how important it is to always be aware of our need for mercy, and then as we are aware of that, we'll be much more liable to show mercy to the people we encounter who may need it.
Yes. And like Tolstoy says, and like you referred to earlier, he says, as one candle kindles another, and thousands are lighted from that one, so also one heart inflames another, and thousands are set a-glowing. And that's so true.
That's very beautiful.
That prayer kind of ignites that candle, I think.
That's very beautiful. Well, thanks for joining us again, and thanks to everyone who is sharing your thoughts and reflections in the comments. Please continue to do so. It encourages us, and have a great week.